Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to my channel. Okay, let me give you a parable. One day, a ship shipwrecked at Cuba. This was in the 18th century. It was a French ship. There was this sailor on it who became unconscious because, well, he hurt his head when the shipwrecked. He fell to the ground and he had a head wound. Now, the Spanish Navy picked up the survivors and they were taken care of at a monastery. The Frenchman also learned Spanish as a kid. Somehow, due to the head wound, he had forgotten that he was a native Frenchman. So he only spoke Spanish when he became conscious, physically conscious. And he began to work as a house cleaner at the residence of a landlord. And he even worked on the plantation as a slave. He was not a slave, but he worked as a slave. He only had one day in the week that he was free, that was on Sunday, and that was reserved for church. So he didn't really have any free time nor spare time. 10 years pass by, and suddenly he has those dreams of him speaking French. And he's thinking, what? He doesn't know anything about it. Then one day he meets someone, a young boy, 12 years old, asks him, "Sir, what's your name?" He says, "I'm Diego." "Oh, where are you from?" He said, "Well, I'm from Cuba, just like you." "Where in Cuba?" the boy asked him. He can't remember. And the boy keeps asking him many questions, but he can't answer them. And then he realized, hold on a minute, why can't I answer simple questions about my youth? Something doesn't add up here. And then the boy asked him for his parents. And now Diego's thinking this goes too far, but then he realized, hold on a minute, where are my parents indeed? The boy handed him some candy and the boy left. The boy just wanted to make some friends with some adults. So the boy had no bad intentions. But now what the boy did alert Diego that something didn't add up here. So he began to ask questions. He went to the archives in Havana. And he went through the birth certificate and he couldn't find his birth certificate. They told him he was 41 years old, so he went to the year of his birth, so-called birth. He couldn't find it. He couldn't even find his last name in the archives, which was on alphabetical order. And he began to think, what? I spent a month in the archives. Every Sunday, instead of going to church, I went to the archives. I researched all day long, all those Sundays, and I couldn't find anything. So little by little, Diego began to understand that he has been lied to. His name isn't even Diego. And he noticed he had a scar at his ear, above his ear, that he couldn't remember how he got that scar. He realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. In this case, Diego wanted to know the truth. And here's another thing, Diego began to ask himself why he worked as a slave. He began to wonder where his relatives were. And here's the thing, after a while, let me say a year later, Diego was in town. Some French people came to trade, and one of the traders said, "Pierre." And Diego was thinking, what? Why call me Pierre? And Diego somehow remembered the face, but he couldn't know what it was. And the individual said, "Pierre, good to see you, man." It was in French, and Diego for some reason understood French. He didn't realize why he understood French. So Diego assumed it was Pierre and began to talk with this guy. This guy was a colleague of his in Paris. And little by little, by interacting with this guy, his memory returned. And then he remembered the day at sea that the ship wrecked 11 years ago. And everything came back. Now, what happened here? This Pierre went through life as Diego. Why? He lost his history. And because he had lost his history, he did not know who he was. Until people that knew who he was and addressed him for who he was approached him. And that's how the lie was shattered. And he realized that he's Pierre, he's not Diego. He operated in a fiction that he was conditioned into, and that fiction was at his expense. For 11 years, he worked very hard at a plantation, but he found out he was a merchant from France, and he still had money in France he had access to. And here's the thing, because he was a sailor that, well, he had a shipwreck, he had a right to receive a compensation of the Spanish Navy. Because the Spanish Navy should have shipped him back to France in safety. They didn't do that, so he had also a right to claim compensations. He had many rights, many options, but he was not aware of those options. Why? Because he was conditioned to view himself in a particular way, and he was not aware, he didn't realize he was conditioned. So the only options he saw for reality, were not real options at all. So just think about it. This guy, Pierre, he was rich, yet he went through life as a poor man, and people could exploit him, take advantage of him at any time. If this guy would have known who he was, do you think the people that exploited him would have wanted him to know who he was? No. Because if you know who you are, then you want to operate as who you are. And here's the thing. He was in Cuba, not in France. So for him to lay hold on what belongs to him, he had to leave Cuba and return to France. Here's the thing. The people that exploited him wanted him to remain where he was. They did not want him to move on, to move forward. Why? Because they didn't want to move forward. They only had a plantation with debts, and they had to pay high taxes to the Spanish authorities. They were not happy with their situation. But here's the thing. They used Pierre's bad condition to transfer their bad energies onto Pierre. And they gave him the name Diego. And as Diego, they had someone to do much of the hard work for them, and they were at ease. So if Diego would one day decide, I'm going to France, what's going to happen? People are going to stop him. And if they couldn't stop him, they would kill him. Why? Because if Pierre escaped and he would have ended up in France, he is also a witness of what happened. And here's the thing, some of the Spanish authorities in Cuba also didn't want to come out what happens, because it would make them look bad internationally. So not only the people that exploited Pierre, also the people that allowed the exploitation to happen also have something to lose. They also want to preserve something. So they are also invested in keeping Pierre in the role of Diego. You get what I'm saying here? Now, this is a parable. That's obvious. That story of Diego, however, is common for many, many people. Now, the case of Diego, or Pierre, is an extreme one. Okay, so you obviously can see something doesn't add up. Well, most people out there, they know who their parents are. They remember their youth for the most part. So their case is not as extreme as Pierre's case that I gave in this parable, but even then, they have been conditioned by society. They have been conditioned by the world. And the conditioning of the world keeps them away from following Christ. It keeps them away from supernatural provisions. It keeps them away from biblical abundance. And it keeps them trapped in having to work very hard to make meets end. It keeps them into the cycle of having to seek relief from financial difficulty. It keeps them trapped into having to put up with the wills of others because you don't have the financial means to pay for other options. You see where this is going? You see how this relates to daily life out there? Now look, in this case, Pierre, once he found out he was not Diego, he still pretended to be Diego because he realized that those people were not willing to let him go. And he began to sell some of the crops of the plantation owners, and he saved the money, and one day he went to Havana, he paid the French ambassador some money for some papers, and he left for France. He arrived in France, and in France he went to Paris to the archives, got his copy, and he claims the money that was left. You see what I'm saying here? This Pierre was smart. But a lot of folks out there, they're not smart. They have become accustomed. They have become comfortable with the conditioning of the world. They don't want to give up the world. Even if they see that the world is self-destructive and the world is evil. Even when they see that, they don't want to face the fight, because understand this. Pierre, to become Pierre again, he was Pierre all the time, so he didn't become Pierre again, forgive me. Let me say it better. Pierre, to be freed from Diego, who he was not, he needed to acknowledge that he was not Diego. But here's the thing. Everything he had over there was based upon this identity, Diego. Everyone related to him as Diego. So for him to become Pierre, well, a change occurred and those people didn't want change. So there would be a fight. But Pierre was willing to face the fight. Now, most people out there, they're not willing to face the fight. So they become like their oppressors. And they become the stakeholders of their own oppression. And before you know it, they're the ones oppressing others and conditioning others to be trapped in the world, just like they were. Conditioned by their peers and by their parents, grandparents, you name it. And that's how generational cycles are kept intact. That's how transgenerational violence or generational curses continue, generation after generation. Look, if your ancestors used to be fishermen and today you're a fisherman, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the craft that's practical in the place where you live. So that things are transferred from generation to generation is nothing wrong. Okay, you transfer knowledge, you transfer technology to the next generation. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But there are things being transferred from generation to generation that shouldn't be transferred. And too often people accept and adapt to what has been transferred onto them because they don't want to face the fight of being delivered. They become frightened of deliverance, they become frightened of freedom, frightened of health, frightened of a long life, frightened of abundance itself. And they're especially frightened of people that want to be free. Not licentious, willing whatever they want, because that's what the world is doing, and that's the bondage people are in. But people that want true freedom and true biblical abundance, folks that don't want to face the fight, that don't want to let go, that don't want to be delivered, they become terrified of such people. And some of you have such people around you. Don't hate on those people, don't turn on them, just don't entrust them with all information about you. Don't share everything with them. Relate wisely unto them, agree with Christ, continue in the faith, endure till the end, be at peace.